Welcome to a brand new YouTube channel called Contextual Bible Study, beginning today. And I like to begin the program by simply saying the very common word shalom, which you've heard many, many times. Just by way of background, there are about 9,000 total Hebrew words in the Bible. And in English, we have 170,000 words, so obviously a gigantic difference. So to understand Hebrew words, you always have to look at the context. And the context of the word shalom can mean peace, as you're probably used to. It can mean hello, goodbye, happiness, completeness, health, prosperity, and even more. Jerusalem actually has as foundation, or as part of its name, shalom. Jerusalem in Hebrew, or foundation of peace, is what it actually means. And of course, Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." This is in John 14:27. So I'm going to begin and end each session with the word shalom, which we badly need today with so much going on in the world and so much contention, dissension, so many troubles. And so that would be shalom from the standpoint of its ultimate meaning in terms of what Jesus said. Now, to begin with, just really quick by way of background, I was born in a little town called Bel Air, Michigan. And I should introduce my name first of all. My name is Denny Thompson. I was born in Bel Air, Michigan, a small town in the northern part of the state. Lived there until age 5. Have a lot of memories of it because my grandfather was a pastor in town. He built a cabin on a lake called Intermediate Lake, which is part of a large chain of lakes. Real beautiful area. So we had a lot of experiences as a young boy going out there. He had Saturday morning pancake breakfasts where the whole church would gather. He was the pastor of a Pilgrim Holiness church. And just lots of memories of him and of my parents. But even though I was only age 5 when we moved, and we moved south to a place called Hudsonville, Michigan. And that's actually where I grew up. I went all the way through the school district, through the town of Hudsonville, Michigan. And after that, after I graduated from high school, I went to a school called Taylor University down in Indiana. I went there 4 years for my degree, and then actually wound up sticking around quite a bit longer and teaching school nearby in a town called Marion, Indiana. My wife, who I married 1 year out of school, was 2 years younger. Sherry's her name. She was a junior at the time. So I took a local job and wound up staying at Marion, Indiana, teaching school for 5 years total. And then we moved back to Michigan, to Granville, Michigan, which is near Hudsonville. And that's where we raised our family. That's where I taught school in Granville. My wife did too for several years, taught in Granville. So that was really the key part of our life. We attended a Nazarene church, which was central to all of our activities. As we were raising our children, they were involved in youth groups, and it really was central to our life. And then, after we retired, we moved back north, very close to Bel Air, Michigan, a town called Central Lake, Michigan. And we actually bought the very cabin that my grandfather built, and we turned it into a year-round house. So that's our current home. Now, this picture right here was taken in 1997. Some of you maybe were there, maybe heard about it, but it was a massive gathering of men in Washington, D.C. It's called Stand in the Gap. And this was to try to strengthen families and manhood and fatherhood of families by a guy named Coach Bill McCartney, who had been the coach of Colorado football team. Just a very large gathering. The reason I'm showing you this is at this gathering, the gathering was actually occurred on a day called the Feast of Trumpets, or Yom Chura, actually in Hebrew. But what it actually was is the very day of the blowing of the horn. And in front of you right now, what you're seeing is a rabbi who was asked by Coach McCartney to blow the horn because this is the first day of the Feast of Trumpets. And that was done at the Feast of Trumpets. And so the horn was blown. And standing way out in the middle of this massive crowd in the middle of this mall on Washington, D.C., the Washington Mall, with these gigantic speakers, what I heard was this. Now that really caught my attention, the blowing of the shofar. This particular shofar is one from a kudu, which is a kosher animal. Most of them are sheep called ram's horns. But as this was blown, it just made this resounding sound that really made an impact on me. And what happened is I literally began to study what was the shofar sound, what's behind it, what's the purpose of it in the Bible, and I started learning all these things. And what that amounted to was the beginning of what I'm going to call like a climbing of a tree in the different branches. This is a picture of that house I mentioned that we bought. And this tree right in front of you is the eastern white pine that's just gigantic. And it was kind of like as I began to read books and go to seminars and go to Israel 8 times, as I began to study more and more about the background of the Bible, beginning with the shofar and working my way into all the other aspects of Hebrew, later to be called Jewish life, it literally was like climbing a tree. It was like going up into the branches, and I go one way and I realized, wow, there's this study over here. I can learn about this. And as I kept going further, there's another study about the background of the Bible, about the Hebrew origins. And so, in a sense, in a picture form, it was like climbing this gigantic tree. Now, the pictures that I'm going to be having here, I have several pictures as far as the actual pictures I'm using, and I want to source them, and they'll all be sourced on the each particular slide. Number one I have is called BiblePlaces.com. A man named Todd Bolin started it. This will be by far the number one source that I use. Another very important source is called FreeBibleImages.org, and there are going to be many, many of those I'm going to be using throughout these presentations. Another one is PreservingBibleTimes.org. Mainly what I'm using there, and all these are with permission, with copyright permission, are videos that are taken over Israel, which are very, very fascinating. Won't be quite as many of those as the other, but there'll be some. And then a very, very large number of the pictures that you'll be seeing are my pictures from my 8 trips to Israel. I literally took thousands and thousands of pictures. Now, in getting things started here, I just want to kind of look at this idea. Part of this whole idea of studying the Bible in this context, and that's what this is all about, is going to help us better understand what's going on today. And I think these are ancient lies that are being played out today, all the time. Satan being the father of lies, this is really number one thing he does to deceive people, is simply lies. In Genesis 3, in the Garden of Eden, said, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? So what this really means, what he was doing is he was assaulting the Bible. Is the Bible really true? Is the Bible absolute? And of course, today that's a major, major assault on the Bible. It's happening all over the place. Then he went on to lie, you will not certainly die. And kind of goes along the idea there are many, many pathways to God. When Jesus said he is the way, not really. There's so many other pathways, this lie will tell us. And a third one, he said, you will be like God, knowing good from evil. And this will go along this whole idea of postmodernism today. The belief that, like, I am the source of all truth, or in a sense, I'm really God. It's simply called postmodern. So Satan is behind every lie in history. He has no truth. His only method is to destroy God's truth. And all he can do is use God's truth and try to pervert it. And sometimes, very often, he has an element of truth in his actual lie. Now, look for just a second at the idea of the terms of Hebrew and Jew and see where these came from. First, these people were called Hebrews, and then later they were called Jews. So, the idea of Hebrew started with the idea of Abraham, who come from a town called Ur, where these arrows begin, and he traveled up and around to Haran and then down into Israel. And Abraham, the first Hebrew, comes from the Hebrew word ivri, which simply means cross over. So that's where the idea of the word Hebrew comes from. It's the first one who crossed over. And when he crossed over was the Tigris and Euphrates River in his route coming to Israel. So where did the term Jew come from? Many, many years later, this land was split into 2 parts, Judah and Israel. And Israel was made up of 10 northern kingdoms, Judah just 2 southern kingdoms. Israel was the first to fall. So Judah was alone at that point, and Judah is Yehuda in Hebrew, is actually where the term Jew came from. So all these people become known as Jews from this point when the kingdom was divided. Now, there's an expression in the rabbis had, and I'll be quoting the rabbis quite a bit because Jesus very much taught as a rabbi, and he even used many of these techniques and sometimes even cited current rabbis of that time period. But one of the important ones was an ideal student is a well-plastered cistern that not even one drop of water can escape. This particular cistern is massive. You can see people standing way in the background, in the bottom of this, way in the background there. A cistern is a place where they could store water. And the idea is that to contain knowledge, we got to come up with a system to do it. And as I begin to study all these things, I felt like my head was going to explode. So I tried to figure out how do I contain all this, and I come up with different ideas, creating presentations and doing a lot of writing and that kind of thing, because I think you've probably experienced this before. As you're learning things, you literally feel like there's no way I can remember this. Now, this is very important. The Bible was written for us, not to us. You might be thinking, what do you mean? Are you some kind of a heretic? Not really. It's just common sense. This is a picture of my Bible. It's a little bit worn here. The Bible was written to an ancient people, but it was written to us. So to understand it completely, it's very important. Is to understand as best we can. We have to know the history, culture, and even the geography of that world. And that's what we're going to be doing in the course of this YouTube channel. We're going to go back into that world to learn it better, to understand. So literally what we're going to try to do here is we're going to be starting it today, and we're going to go back in time to the time of Jesus, which is about 4 BC to 29 AD roughly, all the way back to the time of Abraham, to try to understand these cultures and these settings and the time period, to understand the authors of the Bible, the background, and their audiences also, to understand what they're writing about. Now, to get an idea how we got separated from our Jewish roots, this is a very famous picture of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, done in 1495, and which is very famous. But no, in no way am I criticizing his painting. Obviously, he was a genius. His paintings are amazing. His sculptures, all of it. But I'm showing you this because I want to show you how we got so separated from our Jewish roots, our Hebrew roots. So if we look a little closer at this picture, look at the people closer, we can realize they are the people of the very first of the original Last Supper, called the Passover Seder, were obviously Jewish. These people are European. So clearly, Da Vinci was kind of putting it into his world, putting this idea, this Passover Seder, it was called. The Passover Seder, we call the Last Supper, was always after sundown. You can see very clearly the light is in the background here. So Da Vinci did not include that detail. Now, Jesus would have been at the head of the table, not at the middle. And they would have been reclining in a very different manner than sitting at a table. As I mentioned, they were reclined, not seated. Now, they didn't have fish. There's fish on this table right here, and leavened bread on this table also. They did not have that. Instead, they had lamb and unleavened bread, which become very significant in the Passover Seder. Just totally symbolic, and we'll be getting into that eventually here. So all this to say, we're separated from our Jewish roots, really way back in time, even way before this. And to go back into that world again is really the intent of this whole YouTube channel. This is from a quote from a gentleman that I studied who has since passed away. He was really the probably number one person that I've learned the most from. His name is Dwight Pryor. His organization is called Judaic Christian Studies. It still exists, even though Dwight died a little over 10 years ago. But Dwight said, humanly speaking, the Bible and the early church were a product of the Hebrew mind, so understanding the Hebraic point of view is paramount. Because of history, the Western world has much more influenced by Greek thinking called Hellenism. Hellenism had a strong influence in Israel. Jesus lived in and taught in, as we'll learn as we go on. I just thought he worded this so well. Now, Hellenism had its roots in Alexander the Great, who did not live very long, but he had a tremendous impact. He lived in BC, 356 and 323 BC, so before the time of Jesus. And his conquests were very significant, but I think even more was his influence in the culture, because that influence we still see today. Alexander the Great basically said they'll never be able to resist this world I'm going to give them. And what he did is he set up towns to influence everyone through the media, through education, through religion, and the sports. Now, what does that mean? How did he actually do that? This is a picture of his empire at that time period, which included the Middle East, which included Israel. Now, the media, for one. This particular is a picture is one from a town called Bet Shan in Israel, which is a very well preserved theater. And in that theater, they would have entertainment, but they also would have the news of the day. So they could control the news of the day to influence people. And Alexander believed in doing that because he wanted to influence how people thought. They had theaters. This is a remnant had temples. This is a remnant of a temple of probably the most famous god. His name is Dionysus, the god of wine, and we'll call him party god. And this is what's left of that temple in that area. So the religion, he figured, could influence, and it was pagan, the people of the day very much. So they always had temples, of course, everywhere to honor all the gods. They had gymnasiums, and the gymnasium or school. The gymnasium was actually another name for the school back then, is where he could influence the thinking, obviously, of future adults as children. When they were growing up, they could have great impact on them. So the schools were central. And so were the sports. This is an ancient amphitheater where they had like chariot races, that kind of thing. What's left of it in a town called Bet Shan again in Israel. So that was all. This is a fourth kind of leg here that he decided is going to be important to understand how to influence people. Now, the original Hebraic world, which started in this Israel area, become the Greek-Roman world. It moved up there, as you can see, into this world, this Greek-Roman world. Then it moved over to Europe. So in other words, first the Greeks and then the Romans. The Romans copied these Greek ideas from Alexander the Great. Hellenism, it was called. And of course, that became Europe. I'm just showing you how did this all get over here. How did we become Greek thinkers, which we basically are rather than Hebraic? Over time, the number one group of people that came to the United States were European. So it's only natural that we become more Greek thinking over time. Now, that's not bad. That's just history. It's different than Hebraic thinking, as we'll see in the course of this YouTube channel that I'm putting together here. So more about Alexander. He said, man is a measure of all things. The human body is the ultimate in the universe. The human mind is the ultimate source of truth, and the human body is the ultimate source of beauty. So you can see some ideas here that are real similar to our culture. In Greek thinking, it's kind of like it was very self-centered. It's all about me first. Aristotle, a very famous Greek thinker, said, humble people are small-minded. Interesting. Very different than the Bible, where Jesus said, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Greek thinking is self-expression is the supreme virtue. Focus is on the individual. Hebraic thinking, obedience is the supreme virtue. Focus is on the community. That was so very important, as we'll see as we go through some parables and other aspects of Hebraic Jewish life. Greek thinking, convey a profound meaning by writing a theological essay. Focus is on right thinking. Hebrew, convey a profound meaning by telling a story. The stress is on the right conduct, and storytelling and pictures are so gigantic in that Hebrew world, as we will see. In fact, to me, the Bible almost becomes like a giant picture book. as you really go back and look at all these stories in their Hebraic context. Greek uses rational logic and reason. Hebrew uses pictures and stories, as mentioned. So Hebraic thinking, if you speak to the heart, the head will come. If you speak to the head, the heart may never arrive. So all these stories Jesus told about different parts of nature, the birds and the flowers and the mountains and you name it, all these things that they saw become very significant. And that's how rabbis taught back then. I think it's really super effective too. Now, the traditional Western, which is kind of a Greek idea, words using to describe God. You've probably heard these before. Omniscient, omnipotent are two of the words you hear a lot. Now, if you close your eyes for just a second here and try to picture what omniscient is, so just do that for a second. I'll close mine. Omniscient. Can we see it? Let's try the word omnipotent. Can we picture it? Now, I'm going to guess if you're like me, you couldn't see anything. But in Hebrew, they describe God in pictures. They say God is he's like a rock. And David, when he said this, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, he was using a root word, which probably he was talking about a place called Masada, which we'll be looking at in another presentation, a massive fortress. And my deliverer, my God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. So the idea of literally David, for him, that was the place he could go to escape Saul as he's going after him. He was my safety, this rock. I could go up on Masada. So if you were a defenseless farmer in ancient Israel and the enemy came, you had to go to the city to be safe. You had to run into the city. They would open the door, the gates. You would go in. They would shut it. And this is another name for God. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. Now, see the towers up there. That's where the guards would be, and they'd be looking out. So once you're in that city, you are safe. God is my strong tower. A very, very big one. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. We'll talk a lot about that. Our shepherd is the one who leads to food, water, and safety. Sheep cannot see well, they can hear well, and that becomes very, very significant on following their shepherd. Most of Israel, actually more than half of it, is desert. This is an aerial view looking down on the Dead Sea to the right. With all this dry land, at least half the country's like that. There's a place way down there, which we'll go into it closer, called En-Gedi. You maybe heard of it. It looks like this. David went here all the time. Sometimes you maybe have heard Jesus and God described as living water. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water. This is back in Jeremiah, referring to God. So the idea of living water is significant because water in a dry land was like unbelievably precious. And it kept moving, it kept flowing. It was like continual. So God's mercies, his looking over us never stops. It just keeps moving as that precious water in this very dry land. A land that kind of, that type of thing represents our trials, our troubles. And we'll be looking into that in detail too in future presentations. So the Greek elevated the intellectual and had a low opinion of manual labor. Hebrew had a high opinion of manual labor. God created each with individual unique talents. The rabbis all had trades. You remember Paul had a trade, a tent maker. Jesus had a trade, a carpenter. So that was significant. Very, very different ideas on the idea of work. Now, this is, I think, very significant. The Hebrew word for work and worship are the same. It's the word abad. It's the very, very same word. And Paul wrote, and you do whatever in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. So there is this connection between work and worship. And it's illustrated by this type of thing right here. This would be a craftsman working on sculpturing pottery. So he's learned a specific skill to make pottery, to make all these important things. Now, if a rabbi with authority, and that's a specific type of rabbi in Israel that we'll be learning about, there are other rabbis called Torah teachers, but they were like very high level, the highest level. If they come into a room when a craftsman was busy as his tray like this, they would not be expected, the craftsman would not be expected to stand or to look at the rabbi and to listen to what he had to say. Instead, the rabbi would look at the worker and watch his hands, how God had given him the skill to make these bowls. Literally, what the idea is, he's looking at how this person is worshiping in a sense of using God's given talent to make these important items. So it's a very, very different concept, this whole idea of work and worship. We probably separate these two, but the Bible doesn't. They put them together. It's this unique talent. Now, over the next couple weeks, what we're going to be doing over the next two presentations, I'm going to do the very next one we're going to take an overview of Israel, the land itself, a few of the events that happened in various places, from the coast to an area called the Shephelah, then the mountains, then the desert, the Dead Sea. We're going to go up to the Jezreel Valley, and then up to Galilee. And then the following presentation is strictly going to be Jerusalem. So we're going to learn all about the country, what it looks like, the land, and a few of the events that happen in certain places, and kind of setting the pathway for future presentations where we go much more in depth into that area. So we'll be beginning that with that idea of the coast. So I really appreciate your listening to this little introduction to my new YouTube channel called Contextual Bible Study. And this is just the beginning of it. There are going to be many more coming. We're going to be covering a whole variety of topics I'll be telling you much more about. But I'd like to conclude, as I mentioned, I'd like to begin and conclude each session with a word that I wish for each of us that we really need today in its fullness, in its full meaning, in the way that Jesus said it. So I'd like to conclude with simply my wishes for you, and that would be shalom.